Sometimes one moment defines a man. Not the moment you choose, but the moment that chooses you. Daniel Cole understood this on a Tuesday morning in late September when the sky was still dark enough to hide the city's decay. He'd been standing on the Grand Horizon construction site for 17 minutes longer than necessary, examining the steel framework that would eventually house 200 luxury apartments priced at $3 million each. The sun hadn't cleared the Lake Michigan horizon yet, but the site was already awake, generators humming equipment, warming up the smell of diesel and cold concrete, mixing with the wind that cut down from the north. He was there early because that's what men like Daniel did. They arrived before the whistle checked the work from the previous day, identified problems before the foreman asked about them. This habit had been earned through 12 years of construction, 6 on general labor, 5 as a skilled framer, and 18 months as site supervisor. He'd learned long ago that showing up early was the difference between keeping a job and losing it. There was no margin for error in construction. One oversight meant someone could die. The morning air was cold enough to make his breath visible. He wore a gray Carhartt jacket over a thermal work boots that had been resoled twice and a hard hat that bore the scratches of 100 near misses. His face was weathered in a way that suggested not age alone, but years of sun exposure and the permanent tension that comes from never quite knowing if the next job would materialize after this one ended. He was 42, though he looked older to people who didn't understand that construction ages you differently than other work. Not in obvious ways, but in the eyes, in the set of the shoulders, in the way you calculated risk, the way other men calculated interest rates. The blueprints for Grand Horizon were spread across the temporary office desk, weighted down at the corners with blocks of stone. He'd reviewed them 3 times already. His job today was to verify that the concrete foundation met specifications before the next phase of construction began. It was routine work, the kind of thing he could do without much thought, but Daniel had learned that routine was where people made mistakes. The catastrophic ones usually happened when someone was thinking about something else. He walked the perimeter of the excavated area, checking measurements against the blueprint. The concrete looked solid. The reinforcement grid was properly spaced. Nothing jumped out as obviously wrong, but he made notes anyway. A slight discoloration in one section, a hairline crack near the eastern corner, variations in surface texture. These might mean nothing, or they might mean that someone had cut corners on mixing ratios. He would report them. Whether anyone listened depended on whether they had time and money to care. By 6:47 a.m., Daniel was satisfied enough to move on. He climbed the stairs to the second level of the site, where the framing crew had begun positioning the first set of steel support columns. This was the part of construction he'd always loved back when he had time to feel love for anything. The way steel could be shaped and positioned to hold up impossible amounts of weight. The geometry of it. The logic. He'd studied architecture in college for 2 years before Sophie's mother became pregnant, and his scholarship opportunities evaporated. Now he looked at buildings the way some men looked at photographs of places they'd meant to visit but never would. The foreman, a man named Rick Brennan, with 30 years in the industry and a permanent scowl that had nothing to do with current circumstances, was already on site. He and Daniel exchanged a nod. They didn't need words this early. Rick was good people in the way that mattered. He paid on time, didn't play politics with the crew, and looked out for his workers when it came to safety. The industry had plenty of men who treated construction workers as interchangeable and disposable. Rick wasn't one of them. Morning check going. "Okay, Rick," called out, and Daniel gave a thumbs up. Rick pulled a laminated inspection card from his pocket and made some notes, the pen moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing the same thing every morning for 3 decades. "We're good to start the next phase at 8. Main columns should be in place by end of day if everything goes smooth." Daniel nodded. Everything going smooth was always the optimistic assumption. In his experience, something always went wrong. The question was whether it was the kind of wrong that could be fixed quickly or the kind that stopped everything for investigation. He'd learned to hope for the former and prepare for the latter. He checked his phone, 6:58 a.m. He had time to walk the upper levels once more before the crew arrived. His daughter Sophie was still asleep in their apartment in Riverside, 4 miles from here. He'd get her up at 7:30, make sure she ate breakfast, help her into her school clothes, and drop her at Margaret's apartment at 7:55. Margaret lived one floor below them in the same aging brick building that had housed working-class families for 30 years. She watched Sophie during the day and after school. Daniel paid her $300 a month plus help with her own rent and groceries. It was an arrangement that worked because both of them understood they were doing it out of necessity, not charity. Margaret had lost her husband to a heart attack in 2007, the same year the housing crisis hit and erased the last of their savings. Daniel had lost Sophie's mother 3 years ago to something less dramatic and more final, the realization that she couldn't do this anymore, that the life they'd built didn't suit her, that being a mother and a girlfriend of a construction worker in Chicago had stopped being something she wanted to be. He spent the next hour walking the structure, occasionally making notes, occasionally just standing still, and looking at the metal framework against the gradually lightening sky. This was his morning ritual, the part of the job that existed outside the actual work. It was meditation for men who didn't have time for meditation, observation, for men who'd been trained to see problems before they manifested. By 8:15 a.m., the rest of the crew was arriving. By 8:30, the site was in full motion. Cranes positioned, teams coordinated. The focused chaos of construction beginning its daily cycle. Daniel had been on the site for 2 hours and 40 minutes when the metal scream started. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, though. Afterward, people would debate the exact duration. It was the sound of a support bracket failing under load of metal, stressed beyond its rated capacity of physics, overriding the assumptions that had been built into the design. The scream was followed immediately by the crack of concrete and then the impact, not loud, which was the terrifying part. The loudness would have come if the beam had hit more people. It came down at an angle, sliding off the upper framework like something with intention catching the edge of the building's loading platform before tilting toward the street. Daniel was 50 yards away when it started, talking to one of the framing crew about the afternoon schedule. His body registered the danger before his mind processed it. Muscle memory developed over 12 years of recognizing when things were going wrong on construction sites made him move toward the sound instead of away from it. This was stupid objectively. There was no protocol that said workers should move toward falling steel. But Daniel had spent enough years on sites to know that the first moments after something went catastrophically wrong were the moments when you could still do something about it. The steel beam, probably 3 tons easily, came down at an angle that took out a section of the site's perimeter fence and continued toward the street where cars were parked along the curb. There was a black sedan there, sleek and expensive looking, the kind of vehicle that looked out of place in this neighborhood. Daniel didn't register much about it, except that someone was inside it. He could see motion through the windshield, the shape of a person, the moment of realization that something was coming at them very fast. He was already moving, crossing the site boundary and hitting the street at a sprint that his 42-year-old body registered as agony. The beam had already punched through the roof of the sedan, crumpling the frame with the casual indifference of gravity. Metal screamed against metal. Glass exploded outward in a pattern that looked almost beautiful in the moment before you realized what it meant, that everyone inside that vehicle had probably just experienced something that would reshape the rest of their lives if they got to have one. Daniel didn't stop to assess the situation the way he'd been trained in emergency protocols. His brain was sending signals about crush injuries and asphyxiation and the importance of not touching the vehicle with his bare hands because the metal would be sharp and hot. But the woman inside the car was alive. He could see her moving, trapped by the collapsed frame, her breathing shallow and panicked. The moment that would define him, the one that wasn't chosen but chosen him, lasted less than 2 minutes. He used his body to shield himself from the sharp edges of the broken windshield. His hands, already calloused and scarred from 12 years of work, reached through the remaining glass, not feeling the cuts, because adrenaline had shut down the pain sensors. He found the door frame and pulled. His body had been strengthened by thousands of repetitions of heavy labor. Not gym labor, but the real kind, the kind that built functional strength. He'd spent 8 hours a day for 12 years moving and positioning heavy objects. Now he applied that accumulated force to pulling open a door that had been crumpled by 3 tons of falling steel. The woman inside was Victoria Hale, though Daniel didn't know this yet. He would find out later, along with 300 other people, when the media got involved and started their narratives about rescue and heroism and the unexpected kindness of strangers. But in that moment, he knew only that she was breathing fast and shallow, that her legs were pinned by the twisted frame, that her eyes were showing the particular kind of fear that comes from understanding you're trapped in a space that's actively trying to kill you. He pulled her free using a technique that wasn't in any training manual, but came from the practical knowledge of a body that understood how to move heavy things. His hands, now bleeding freely but still working, found her torso and provided the leverage that the doorframe had prevented. She came free in a way that suggested she'd been holding herself tensed, fighting against gravity and metal, conserving whatever energy might be necessary to survive, though. She gasped when she hit the pavement, the kind of gasp that meant the pinned weight against her legs had been very significant. Daniel kept his hands on her because his brain understood that the next few seconds mattered. Shock could kill people as easily as the impact itself. He was already running calculations about hospital time, about whether anyone had called 911, about what the next 3 hours would look like for this woman. He was also thinking about being late to pick up Sophie. He needed to call Margaret. But first he needed to make sure this woman wasn't about to stop breathing. She was conscious and talking, her voice shaking. "I can't. My leg, there's pain." Daniel's hands found her left leg and found the injury, assessed it. Probable fracture below the knee. Serious but not immediately life-threatening. He removed his jacket, the thick Carhartt that had kept him warm through the morning, and wrapped it around her shoulders because the human body in shock loses heat regardless of outside temperature. "Ambulance is coming," he said, and he knew this was true because he could hear the sirens already cutting through the morning air with the rhythm of urgency. "You're going to be okay. They're coming." She was staring at him, taking in his face, his bloodied hands, the intensity of his focus. There was something like recognition in her expression, but also confusion, as if she couldn't quite place what she was seeing. People looked like that sometimes when their brains were busy processing trauma. The recognition would probably fade when the shock wore off. The sirens got louder. Within 2 minutes, the first responders arrived. Paramedics moved into the space Daniel had occupied, and he stepped back, already assessing where he needed to be. The site supervisor would want a report. There might be other injuries. His presence here was now part of an official investigation that would determine who'd made the failure that had put this woman's life at risk. "What's your name?" the woman called out as the paramedics were securing her on a stretcher. But Daniel was already moving away, already becoming part of the crowd of construction workers that had gathered at the site's perimeter. He didn't answer because he wasn't thinking about himself at that moment. He was thinking about the failure that had caused this. He was thinking about his job security. He was thinking about whether being the man who'd pulled someone from wreckage would help his career or hurt it. Mostly, though, he was thinking about calling Margaret to tell her he'd be later than expected. The site descended into chaos that blurred the rest of the morning into something that felt disconnected from normal time. Fire trucks arrived. Police began photographing the beam. An official from the Department of Building and Zoning appeared with a clipboard and an expression that suggested this was not the phone call he'd wanted to get. The city's media helicopter could be heard in the distance, though the tall buildings prevented it from getting a clear shot. Daniel gave his statement to a police officer. Basic facts, no embellishment. He'd been on site. He'd heard the failure. He'd assessed the situation and rendered assistance. He didn't mention that he'd been thinking about being late or that pulling the woman from the car had taken less conscious thought than his morning inspection of the foundation. He didn't mention that his hands were still shaking, though not from fear. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline come down, the particular exhaustion that followed immediate action taken under pressure. By 10:30 a.m., the site was shut down. All non-essential personnel were sent home. Daniel clocked out and drove toward Riverside, exceeding the speed limit by enough to catch a police officer's attention, but not enough to get stopped. His hands were bandaged at a station set up by the paramedics. The doctor, or maybe just a medical technician, Daniel wasn't entirely sure, had said they weren't serious, that they'd scar, but the functionality was intact. Daniel's primary concern was that he'd gotten blood on the steering wheel, and he'd need to clean that before Sophie noticed. Margaret opened the door of her apartment, with Sophie already in her arms, the girl reaching out for her father with the particular urgency of a child who'd sensed that something had disrupted the normal flow of the day. "Mrs. Hernandez from the school called," Margaret said without preamble. "Said there was an accident at one of the construction sites. News is saying someone got hurt." Daniel didn't correct her by saying someone had gotten hurt, someone had been rescued. He just nodded and took Sophie, pressing her against his chest and feeling the rightness of her weight, her breathing, her existence against his body. This was the equation that mattered. Not the woman in the car, not his job, not the failure that had caused the beam to fall. The continuation of his daughter's life, was the only metric that actually counted. "I'm okay," he told Margaret, answering the question she hadn't asked. "I was on site, but I wasn't involved in the actual accident. Just happened to be nearby." Margaret's expression suggested she didn't entirely believe him, but she was also old enough to understand that men sometimes told the minimum necessary truth when they were processing something large. She didn't push. She just reminded him that dinner was at 6 if he wanted to come down, and that Sophie had eaten lunch but was probably ready for a snack. Back in his apartment, Daniel set Sophie up with juice and some stringy cheese, then went to the bathroom and examined his bandaged hands more carefully. The cuts were already starting to sting, which meant the adrenaline was finishing its exit from his system. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and saw a man who looked exactly like he did every other day, worn, tired, older than his actual years, but fundamentally unchanged. Nothing on his face suggested that he'd pulled someone from a car that morning. Nothing on his body indicated that he'd performed an action that people would probably classify as heroic. This was fine with him. Heroism was a narrative that other people constructed. What he'd done was the minimum required action when confronted with someone in danger. It didn't deserve a story. It just deserved to be completed and forgotten, so he could return to the actual work of his life, which was keeping his daughter safe, keeping their apartment paid for, keeping the routine intact. But the woman, the one whose name he didn't know yet, whose face he already suspected he'd see for weeks in the small hours of the morning when sleep came fitfully, was asking questions about him. She was being transported to a hospital. Medical personnel would be taking information. Within hours, there would be video footage. Within days, there would be media coverage. By evening, Daniel would become the construction worker who'd pulled a CEO from wreckage and then disappeared without waiting for thanks. It wouldn't be his choice. It would just be what happened when the moment that chose you turned into a story that other people needed to tell. Victoria Hale regained full consciousness in an ambulance, with paramedics working on her leg and asking questions she only half understood. She'd been thinking about a meeting at 10 o'clock, something about the Grand Horizon Project timeline, when the world had become metal and violence and pain. Now she was being moved and spoken to and evaluated by people whose faces she wouldn't remember. The man's face, though, that she remembered. His hands had been bleeding. His expression had been focused in a way that suggested he'd encountered this kind of situation before. He hadn't looked like a hero. He'd looked like someone solving a problem quickly and efficiently, the way you'd look if you were fixing something broken and necessary. She tried to ask the paramedics about him, but they were concentrating on her leg, on establishing IV lines, on monitoring her vitals. By the time they reached the hospital, Victoria had been given enough pain medication that the world was starting to feel less urgent, more acceptable. She stopped asking questions about the man who'd pulled her from the car and let the hospital's systems process her, examine her, assess the damage. The doctor's conclusion was that she'd been extraordinarily lucky. Fractured tibia, minor lacerations, significant bruising, but nothing permanent, nothing life-altering. In another few inches, the beam could have crushed her chest. In another few seconds, she might have been unconscious from the initial impact. In another version of events, she would be having a very different conversation with a very different kind of doctor. But she'd been pulled free by a man whose name she didn't know, a man who'd asked nothing from her, a man who'd disappeared back into whatever life he led, which presumably didn't involve multi-million-dollar buildings or boards of directors or the responsibility of hundreds of employees. By the time the pain medication wore off enough that she could think clearly, Victoria was already planning how she would find him. It was a compulsion she didn't entirely understand. She'd been grateful to people who had thanked them properly and moved forward. But this was different. This was the first time in her professional life that someone had risked something for her without any expectation of return. She needed to understand that. She needed to know what motivated a man to pull a stranger from wreckage and then disappear. The hospital's phone was on the nightstand. She could have made calls, could have started the apparatus of investigation immediately. Instead, she lay in the hospital bed and thought about the man's hands, about the intensity of his focus, about the weight of his jacket around her shoulders. She tried to reconstruct his face from memory, but found that fear and shock had filtered out specificity. She could remember that he had dark hair, that his expression held no judgment, that his hands had been competent and controlled even as they bled. By the time she was discharged the next morning, she'd already begun the process of finding him. By the time she left the hospital, the search had become something larger than gratitude. It had become a question about what it meant to live in a world where someone could act without expectation of reward. It had become the thing that would lead her eventually to Riverside Park on a Saturday morning, looking for a man she didn't know, by a description that could have applied to thousands of other men. But first she had to find out his name. And first the world had to begin telling the story of what had happened on Grand Horizon construction site on a Tuesday morning in September when a man had done what anyone should do and then disappeared. Victoria Hale's world at least would never be quite the same after that moment. She just didn't know it yet. She would spend the next 3 weeks in physical therapy, allowing her leg to heal, allowing the bruises to fade from purple to yellow to the faint residue of trauma. She would attend board meetings where people would suggest she should rest, should recover, should take time to process the accident. She would refuse all of it and instead begin the quiet work of finding the man who'd pulled her from wreckage. The hospital had records of first responders, but not of construction workers. Security footage from Grand Horizon showed a man moving quickly and efficiently, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to identify him definitively. The construction company's payroll showed hundreds of workers assigned to the project at various times. She would need to be more systematic. On her third morning in the hospital, Victoria noticed something that made her sit up straighter despite the pain in her leg. On the chair beside her bed, neatly folded, was a man's jacket, tan weathered with the label of an industrial workwear company. She reached for it and found in the pocket a receipt from a coffee shop dated 3 years ago. The jacket had been washed since then. She could smell the fading residue of detergent, but the shape still held the form of the body that had worn it regularly. The man had left his jacket with her. He'd gone back into the chaos and retrieved it, somehow left it for her to find. This was the detail that would haunt her for weeks. The jacket was an act of tenderness in a moment that could have been purely utilitarian. It suggested that he'd thought of her after the immediate danger had passed. It suggested that he understood she'd be cold, that she'd be frightened, that she'd need something substantial between herself and the world. She held the jacket and made a decision. She would find him, and she would understand why someone who lived her same city, breathed her same air, occupied her same world could operate according to completely different principles. Daniel Cole woke at 5:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning, 48 hours after pulling someone from a car, and did what he always did. He showered in water that was barely warm because the hot water heater was performing inconsistently. He drank black coffee because he'd learned years ago that sugar and cream were luxuries that added up over a month to real money. He made Sophie's lunch turkey sandwich apple a cookie he'd saved from the previous evening's dinner because it was a brand that cost less if you bought in bulk. Sophie woke when he came into her room as she always did. She was 7 years old enough to understand that her father worked hard and that the world was full of people who left when things got difficult. She had templates for reliable affection that came from consistency rather than grand gestures. When her father came into her room every morning and said, "Time to rise and shine, sunshine," she understood that this was love expressed in the form of structure and presence. "Daddy, there was a big accident on the news," she said while he was helping her into her school clothes. She was talking about the Grand Horizon incident. The news had run extensive coverage, cell phone video, drone footage, interviews with other workers. "Was it at your building?" "It was at a building I work on sometimes," Daniel said, which was technically true, but strategically incomplete. "But I wasn't there when it happened." This wasn't technically true, but Daniel had learned that children needed certainty more than they needed complete information. Sophie needed to believe that her father was safe. The specifics of how he'd come to be on a site where 3-ton steel beams fell was information she didn't need to process at 7 years old. "But you're okay," she said, and it was a statement, not a question. She'd already processed the information and filed it under, "Father is still here, things remain stable." "I'm okay," he confirmed, and helped her eat her cereal while she arranged the pieces into patterns before consuming them one by one. This was her ritual. It had started when she was 5 after her mother left. Daniel had read somewhere that children process trauma through repetition and ordering, that arranging cereal into patterns was Sophie's way of bringing structure to a world that had demonstrated unpredictability. He never interrupted the process. He just sat across from her and drank his bitter coffee and listened to her describe her plans for the day. At 7:45 a.m., they were walking down the stairs to Margaret's apartment. Margaret answered the door with the smile she reserved for Sophie, genuine warm, the kind of smile that came from actually liking another human being, rather than performing the social obligations of liking them. She was 74 years old, a widow for 16 years, and had become the closest thing to extended family that either Daniel or Sophie possessed. "Good morning, sunshine girl," Margaret said, which was what she called Sophie, adopting Daniel's nickname and making it her own. "Did your daddy tell you I have banana bread today?" Sophie's eyes widened with genuine pleasure. Margaret made banana bread every Tuesday because it was inexpensive and nutritious, and because she understood that small treats mattered to a child who didn't get very many of them. Daniel handed Margaret the lunch he'd prepared and left the envelope containing the $300 payment he made to her every month. Margaret didn't count it; they'd moved past that transaction level, but she did nod with the understanding that they both shared responsibility for keeping the system running. "You had a long day yesterday," Margaret said quietly, which was her way of acknowledging that she knew something significant had happened. "It's handled," Daniel said, which was also not entirely true, but was the agreed-upon shorthand between two people who understood that sometimes specific details were less important than the overall narrative of coping. Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "You're a good man, Daniel. Don't let this city convince you otherwise." He drove to Grand Horizon and found the site shut down, cordoned off with police tape and various official vehicles. He parked a block away and walked toward the crowd of workers who were standing around in clusters, waiting for word about whether they'd be working today or if the site would remain closed for investigation. Rick Brennan was there talking to someone from the Department of Labor and the contractor's insurance company. He saw Daniel and gestured him over with a quick nod. "They're doing a full investigation," Rick said. "No work until they've cleared the structural integrity of everything above the point of failure. I'm guessing we're out 4 or 5 days minimum, maybe longer." Daniel nodded. This was bad news financially. He had exactly 3 weeks of expenses saved if the work dried up completely. After that, there was student debt and various smaller obligations that would start coming due. He'd been through job disruptions before, though. He had protocols for budget cutting and for finding interim work. The question was whether this would be a 4-day interruption or something longer. "The guy who fell," Daniel asked, as if he didn't already know everything about it. "Woman," Rick corrected. "Some executive from Hale Development. They're saying she's going to be okay, all things considered. Could have been a whole lot worse." "A worker Daniel didn't recognize, probably temporary. Probably wouldn't be back," said Guy. "Pulled her out of the car before it got crushed completely." "Pretty heroic." Daniel didn't comment. He just listened to the conversation move in other directions towards speculation about who was at fault, about whether the site had been inspected correctly, about the inevitable lawsuit that Hale Development would face. He drove home and spent the afternoon doing the things he always did on unexpected days off. He fixed the leaking kitchen sink that Margaret had mentioned last month. He repaired the weather stripping on the apartment's front door. He took Sophie to Riverside Park when she came home from school and watched her play while he sat on a wooden bench, coffee from the thermos in his hand, and mentally recalculated the month's budget. The park was only slightly occupied at 3:30 p.m. on a Wednesday. A few mothers with toddlers, an older man feeding pigeons, a couple of teenagers on skateboards. Sophie ran toward the monkey bars and began the series of movements that constituted her primary physical interest, hanging, swinging briefly, pretending to be various animals. Daniel watched her and thought about the woman from the car. He'd watched the news coverage that morning before his shift. They'd identified her as Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Development, his employer in a significant way. The company he'd been working for on and off for 2 years had been built by this woman. She'd attended the meetings where project timelines were discussed, where profit margins were debated, where decisions about who got hired and who got cut were made. He wondered if she'd thought about him at all. He wondered if she was the kind of person who understood that someone had made a choice to risk something for her. He wondered if she'd expect something in return. This last thought was the one that troubled him most, and it troubled him enough that he tried to push it away, to reframe the event as simply what you did when confronted with someone in danger. But he'd lived long enough to understand that gratitude in the world he inhabited almost always came with strings. People didn't give without expecting to receive. That was the fundamental logic of every transaction he'd engaged in since leaving college. A woman approached his bench. She was well-dressed in a way that suggested money and intention, wearing jeans and a simple blouse that somehow made them look like they'd cost more than Daniel's entire monthly wardrobe. She had green eyes and blonde hair, and an expression that suggested she was used to being listened to. "She's fearless," the woman said, watching Sophie swing upside down from the monkey bars. Daniel turned and assessed her. The protective part of his brain, the part that existed specifically to identify threats to Sophie, activated immediately. This was a stranger approaching him in a park while his daughter was playing. The rational part of his brain understood that this was almost certainly not a threat. The protective part wasn't interested in probability. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone level in a way that it communicated that he wasn't going to be manipulated by pleasant conversation. The woman smiled slightly as if she understood and appreciated the protective stance. "I live nearby. Sometimes I come here on weekends to clear my head." This was obviously not true. It was late afternoon on a Wednesday. Daniel didn't comment on the obvious lie. He just waited for her to say what she'd actually come to say. "She's wonderful," the woman said, and Daniel understood that she was complimenting Sophie, which was either a genuine statement or a manipulation tactic designed to build rapport. "She's everything," Daniel said, which was true, and also was the kind of statement that communicated that he wasn't interested in extended conversation. The woman nodded as if this answer had meant something to her. She gestured vaguely toward the walking path that circled the park. "It's a beautiful park. I don't come often enough." Silence stretched between them. Daniel had become comfortable with silence over the years. It was a tool that told him things about people, whether they could exist in it peacefully or whether it made them uncomfortable. This woman seemed able to exist in it, which suggested either that she was confident enough not to need to fill space, or that she was calculating something and silence was part of her strategy. Sophie scrambled across the grass and stopped directly in front of the woman, showing the particular fearlessness of children toward strangers. "Hi, are you Daddy's friend?" Sophie asked without any trace of shyness, which was consistent with how she'd been raised to be polite but not fearful to engage with the world, but to understand that her father's judgment was the final filter for safety. The woman smiled, and this smile seemed genuine in a way that made Daniel slightly less suspicious. "Hello, Sophie. I'm Victoria." Sophie tilted her head, assessing this new information. "Do you build buildings too?" "Daddy builds everything. He fixed Mrs. O'Connor's sink and made me a bookshelf for my birthday. He can fix anything." Victoria's expression was careful, measured in a way that suggested she was hearing something important in what Sophie had said. "That's impressive. You're lucky to have him." Sophie grinned widely with the particular confidence of a child who knew her father was reliable. "I know. He's the best." Sophie's attention was diverted by the ice cream truck that appeared near the park's entrance, and she gasped with the kind of genuine excitement that only 7-year-olds seemed capable of. She ran off quickly when Daniel handed her some cash, leaving him alone with the woman again. Victoria sat on the far end of the bench, careful not to intrude on his space. "She adores you," she said quietly. "She's my daughter," Daniel said. "Of course she does." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I was raised by my mother alone. I remember her exhaustion." This statement seemed designed to create connection, to suggest that Victoria understood something about his situation. Daniel didn't appreciate the attempt. His exhaustion was his own situation, his own calculation, his own choice. It didn't need to be universalized or validated by someone else's childhood experience. "It's not so bad," Daniel said. "We manage." Victoria turned to look at him directly for the first time since sitting down. "What would you need to do more than manage to actually—" "I don't want your money, Miss Hale," Daniel said. And this is when he understood that she'd been testing him, observing him, trying to determine something about who he was. "I don't need anything from you. That's not how the world works for people like us. You give help, there's strings, always." Victoria accepted this without defensiveness. "Fair point." Sophie returned with 3 popsicles, beaming with pride at her purchases. She handed one to Victoria with the matter-of-fact statement that vanilla because everyone likes vanilla. Victoria accepted it with a startled laugh. "Thank you, sweetheart." They sat together, then Daniel watchful Sophie chattering between bites about her teacher and the class hamster and the math assignment she'd found easy and the girl who'd been mean to her yesterday. Victoria listened with an attention that seemed genuine rather than performed. She asked follow-up questions. She seemed actually interested in the narrative of a 7-year-old's day. Daniel watched this interaction and felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, not gratitude, but something more like recognition. Victoria was watching his daughter the way he watched people. She was paying attention to details. She was trying to understand the logic of another human being. When they finished their popsicles, Sophie wanted to return to the monkey bars, and Victoria watched her go before turning to Daniel. "I know it was you, Barry," Victoria said quietly. "At the accident, you pulled me out of that car." Daniel's jaw tightened. This was the moment he'd been dreading and hadn't quite known he was dreading. Now that it was here, he understood why. She wanted something. She wanted gratitude to manifest his obligation. She wanted to be saved to mean something beyond the simple fact of being saved. "I did what anyone should do," he said. Victoria shook her head. "No, they wouldn't. I've been in business 25 years. Most people would have kept walking." Daniel stood up. He wasn't angry exactly, but he was finished with this conversation. "Look, I appreciate you finding me, but I don't need recognition for doing the right thing. You were in danger. I helped. That's it." Victoria looked up at him. "I'm not here to thank you for being heroic. I'm here to understand why you did it." This stopped him. It was a different question than he'd expected. "Because you needed help," he said. "That's not an answer," Victoria said. "That's a reflex." Daniel sat back down because something in her question had registered as genuine, as different from the usual transactional approach to human interaction. "I don't understand what you're asking." Victoria looked out at Sophie, who was now hanging from the monkey bars. "Why does someone risk their life for a stranger with no expectation of return? What motivates that?" "The same thing that makes you stay at work despite being injured," Daniel said, surprising himself with the observation. "Some things matter more than personal safety." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "I've built an entire company on the assumption that everything's negotiable, that every action is part of a transaction. I'm trying to understand how that assumption could be wrong." Sophie returned glowing from exertion and success, and the conversation shifted. But before Victoria left, as evening was approaching and Daniel was getting ready to take Sophie home, she said quietly, "Can I come to your apartment sometime? I want to understand how you live." Daniel's instinct was to refuse. His apartment was private. It was the space where he and Sophie existed outside of the world's observation. But something about Victoria's directness about her refusal to pretend to be something she wasn't made him agree. That evening, he made dinner and helped Sophie with homework and read to her while she fell asleep. And in the particular moments of quiet that came after a child was asleep, he allowed himself to acknowledge that something had shifted. A woman had entered his world. And unlike the women who'd come before, unlike Sophie's mother, this one seemed to be looking at him not with pity or resentment or the desire to change him, but with genuine curiosity about what it meant to build a life on principle, when principle was the thing most people abandoned first. He didn't trust that curiosity. But he also understood that trusting or not trusting didn't matter very much. She would come to his apartment because he'd agreed to it. She would see where he lived and how he lived and probably make some judgment about it. And he would probably see her again because something about the conversation they'd started felt unfinished, like there were questions neither of them had quite asked yet. In the morning, he would return to work. In the evening, he would help Sophie with homework. On Friday, he would see the news coverage of the accident investigation. And on Saturday, Victoria would appear at his apartment door carrying something like hope and something like fear, which was the same thing to people like her who'd never quite learned the difference. But for now, he let sleep come and didn't think about what any of it meant. Victoria Hale appeared at Daniel's apartment on Saturday evening, carrying nothing but a leather portfolio and an expression that suggested she'd spent considerable time deciding whether to come at all. Daniel opened the door and stepped aside without greeting, which Victoria understood was the closest thing to welcome she'd receive. The apartment was exactly what she'd expected and somehow entirely different. It occupied the third floor of a building that had been constructed in 1947, back when Chicago's working-class neighborhoods were designed for factory workers who needed affordable housing within walking distance of steel mills and automobile plants. The hallway smelled faintly of cooking oil and old wood. The walls were painted institutional beige, the kind of color chosen not for aesthetic reasons, but because it was cheap and didn't show dirt. Daniel's apartment consisted of 3 rooms, a combined living area and kitchen, one bedroom for Sophie, and a smaller room that Daniel used for himself. The furniture was functional rather than decorative. A couch that had been repaired multiple times with duct tape along the armrests. A coffee table constructed from salvaged wood and cinder blocks. Bookshelves made from particle board and metal brackets sagging slightly under the weight of textbooks and children's books arranged without any obvious organizational system. Victoria noticed immediately the architecture book on the table, a hardcover text titled Principles of Urban Design with a publication date of 2006. The pages were worn in a way that suggested repeated reading. Sticky notes protruded from various chapters. Margin notes had been added in careful handwriting that analyzed building patterns and community spaces. "You studied architecture," Victoria said, and it wasn't a question because she'd already investigated his background thoroughly enough to know he'd attended the University of Illinois for 2 years on a partial scholarship before leaving. "Long time ago," Daniel said. He was in the kitchen area pouring coffee from a pot that looked older than Sophie. Didn't finish. "Why not?" Daniel handed her a mug without asking if she wanted sugar or cream, apparently having decided that she'd drink it black or not at all. Sophie's mother got pregnant. Scholarship didn't cover childcare. Jobs in architecture require unpaid internships. Construction paid immediately. Math was simple. Victoria accepted the coffee and found it stronger than she was accustomed to, bitter, in a way that suggested it had been sitting in the pot for hours. She drank it anyway because refusing seemed like it would communicate something about class that she was trying not to communicate. Sophie emerged from her bedroom wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon rockets, her hair still damp from a bath. She registered Victoria's presence with the particular curiosity of children who'd been told a guest was coming but hadn't entirely believed it. "Hi, Victoria," Sophie said with the formality of a child performing social obligations. "Are you staying for dinner? Daddy made soup." "I don't want to intrude," Victoria said, which was the polite deflection she'd learned from years of corporate socializing. "You already are," Daniel said without particular malice. "Might as well eat." The soup was simple chicken broth with vegetables and noodles served in mismatched bowls at a table that seated 3 if everyone was comfortable with proximity. Sophie talked throughout the meal about school and the class hamster who'd escaped yesterday and been found behind the teacher's desk. Victoria listened with the same focused attention she demonstrated at the park, asking follow-up questions that suggested genuine interest rather than performed politeness. Daniel watched this interaction and found himself recalibrating his initial assessment of Victoria. She wasn't performing charity or slumming. She was genuinely curious about his daughter's world in a way that suggested she found it interesting rather than quaint. When Sophie described the complicated social dynamics of second grade, who was friends with who'd been mean, who'd shared their lunch, Victoria nodded with the seriousness of someone listening to a boardroom presentation about market dynamics. After dinner, Sophie was sent to bed with promises that she could read for 15 minutes before lights out. This left Daniel and Victoria alone in the living area with the architecture book between them, like an unasked question. "You're good at it," Victoria said, gesturing toward the book. "The notes you've made, they're sophisticated. You understand how buildings interact with communities." Daniel picked up the book and flipped through pages he'd read dozens of times. "Understanding doesn't pay rent." "No, but it could," Victoria said. She opened the leather portfolio she'd brought and removed a set of blueprints. "I need help with something. Professional help." Daniel looked at the blueprints and immediately recognized Riverside, the neighborhood where he lived, mapped out in technical detail with property boundaries and existing structures marked. Red lines indicated proposed demolition. Blue lines showed new construction. "This is gentrification," Daniel said flatly. "Yes," Victoria agreed without defensiveness. "But it doesn't have to be displacement. That's what I'm trying to prevent." She spread the blueprints across the coffee table, anchoring the corners with whatever objects were available. Sophie's juice cup, the architecture book, a bowl that had contained the evening's soup. The plans showed a comprehensive redevelopment of 6 city blocks, replacing aging apartment buildings with new construction that would presumably rent for 3 times current rates. "Hale Development bought Riverside 5 years ago," Victoria explained. "The original plan was standard gentrification, renovate, increase property values, attract wealthier residents. I approved that plan because it made financial sense. And now, Daniel asked, already suspecting where this conversation was heading. Now I want to do something different. I want to renovate Riverside in a way that protects current residents. That means affordable housing commitments, rent stabilization, community input on design. But I need someone who understands what Riverside actually needs, not what developers think it needs. Daniel studied the blueprints with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years reading technical documents. The proposed buildings were standard contemporary design, efficient use of space, minimal wasted square footage, construction methods that prioritize cost over character. Nothing about the plans suggested they'd been designed with actual people in mind. "These are terrible," he said. Victoria's expression didn't change. "I know. That's why I'm here. You want me to redesign your gentrification project so it feels less like gentrification. I want you to help me build something that doesn't destroy the community that's already here. I want Riverside to be better without erasing the people who've made it what it is." Daniel set the blueprints down and looked at Victoria with the directness that came from not particularly caring what she thought of him. "Why should I believe you? Hale Development has been buying up properties and raising rents for 5 years. You've already displaced dozens of families. Why would this be different?" "Because I was wrong," Victoria said, and her voice carried the particular weight of someone admitting something difficult. "I spent 25 years building a company on the assumption that profit was the only metric that mattered. The accident, you pulling me from that car, it made me realize that some things can't be quantified. Kindness can't be measured in quarterly earnings. Community can't be reduced to property values." "That's a nice speech," Daniel said, "but speeches don't protect people from eviction notices." Victoria reached into the portfolio again and produced a legal document, multiple pages bound with the formality of corporate paperwork. "This is a legally binding commitment. 50% affordable housing for existing Riverside residents. Rent increases capped at inflation. Community Oversight Board with veto power over design changes. If I violate any of these terms, residents can sue, and the development stops immediately." Daniel read through the document slowly, his construction-trained eye identifying the technical language that would make this enforceable. The commitments were real. The penalties for violation were substantial enough to matter even to a company the size of Hale Development. "This will cost you millions," Daniel said. "Yes. Your board won't approve it. They already voted against it. I'm proceeding anyway using personal assets." Daniel looked up from the document. "You're betting your own money on this. I'm betting that doing the right thing will eventually prove profitable. But even if it doesn't, I'm doing it anyway." This was the moment when Daniel understood that Victoria wasn't performing corporate social responsibility or trying to rehabilitate her reputation. She was genuinely trying to solve a problem in a way that prioritized people over profit. It was naive, probably. It might fail. But the fact that she was attempting it suggested something about who she was becoming rather than who she'd been. "If I help you with this, I risk my job," Daniel said. "Hale Development is one of the major contractors in Chicago. If word gets out that I'm working against standard development practices, I become unemployable." "I know. And if this fails, if the project collapses or the money runs out, Sophie suffers. Her stability depends on my income." "I understand." Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking down at Riverside streets. Streetlights illuminated the neighborhood in patches of yellow and shadow. He could see Margaret's apartment building, the corner store where he bought groceries, the park where Sophie played. This was his community. These were the people who'd helped him when Sophie's mother left. These were the neighbors who'd watched his daughter grow from an infant to a 7-year-old who believed the world was fundamentally safe because the people around her were fundamentally good. If he said no, Victoria's project would proceed with or without him. Standard gentrification would continue. Riverside would become another neighborhood where working-class families were gradually replaced by young professionals who could afford market-rate apartments. Margaret would receive an eviction notice eventually. Sophie would lose the only home she'd known. If he said yes, he risked everything he'd built over 12 years of careful financial management. He risked his job security, his professional reputation, his ability to provide for Sophie. But he also gave Riverside a chance to survive as something other than a developer's portfolio investment. The choice wasn't between good and bad, It was between different kinds of risk, different calculations of what mattered more, personal security or collective survival. I need to talk to Margaret first, Daniel said finally. She has more invested in Riverside than I do. If she thinks this is worth pursuing, I'll help you. Victoria nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected. When will you decide? Tomorrow. Come back Sunday evening. After Victoria left, Daniel went to Sophie's room and found her still awake, reading by the small lamp beside her bed. She looked up when he entered with the particular expression children reserve for moments when they knew something significant was being decided. Is Victoria nice? Sophie asked. I think so, Daniel said. I'm still figuring it out. She listened to me talk about the hamster. Most adults pretend to listen, but they're really thinking about other things. She was really listening. Daniel sat on the edge of Sophie's bed. If I had to work on a special project that might take a lot of time and we might have less money for a while, would you be okay with that? Sophie considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. Would we still have our apartment? Yes. Would I still go to my school? Yes. Would you still be my daddy? Always. Sophie smiled. Then it's okay. We can have less money. Money isn't the most important thing. Daniel kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, Sophie's voice came quiet and certain. You're going to help people, aren't you? Like you helped Victoria. Maybe. You should. You're good at helping people. The next morning, Daniel knocked on Margaret's door and found her making bread, the apartment filled with the smell of yeast and warmth. She gestured him inside without stopping, her kneading apparently having developed the ability to hold conversations while performing the complicated physical choreography of bread making. There's a woman, Baum, Daniel started and Margaret laughed. I saw her leave last night. Well-dressed, expensive shoes. Not from Riverside. She's from Hale Development. She wants to renovate Riverside in a way that protects current residents. She's asking me to help design it. Margaret's hands stilled in the dough. Hale Development has been buying up buildings and raising rents for 5 years. Why would this be different? Daniel explained Victoria's legal commitments. The affordable housing guarantees the community oversight provisions. Margaret listened without interrupting her experienced assessment of bullshit, apparently suspending judgment until all the information was available. What does she want from you? Margaret asked when he finished. Architectural consultation. Someone who understands what Riverside actually needs. And what will it cost you? Probably my job. Definitely my professional reputation if this fails. Margaret returned to kneading, working the dough with the steady rhythm of someone who'd performed this action thousands of times. I've lived in Riverside for 43 years. I raised my children here. My husband worked himself to death here, literally heart attack on the factory floor when he was 52. This place is full of ghosts for me, but they're good ghosts. They're the kind that remind you what matters. She shaped the dough into a ball and placed it in a bowl to rise. If this woman is telling the truth, then Riverside has a chance to survive as something other than a memory. If she's lying, then we're no worse off than we already are. But if you don't try, then we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been possible. So you think I should do it? I think you already know what you're going to do. You're just checking to make sure you're not alone in the decision. Daniel hugged Margaret, which was rare enough that she patted his back with flour-covered hands and made a joke about getting his shirt dirty. But her eyes were wet when he left, and he understood that she'd given him permission, not because she believed success was likely, but because she believed trying was necessary. Victoria returned Sunday evening as promised. Daniel answered the door and said simply, I'll help you, but I have conditions. They worked at Daniel's kitchen table that night, and the next night, and the night after that. Victoria brought blueprints and financial projections and community demographic studies. Daniel brought his architecture textbooks and years of construction experience and an understanding of what people actually needed versus what developers thought they needed. The early conversations were tense, marked by fundamental disagreements about what constituted good design. Victoria thought in terms of efficiency and cost per square foot. Daniel thought in terms of how children moved through spaces and whether elderly residents could navigate stairs comfortably. This hallway is too narrow, Daniel said, marking up one of Victoria's blueprints with a red pen. It meets building code requirements, Victoria countered. Building codes are minimum standards. Margaret uses a walker sometimes. This hallway won't accommodate that comfortably. Make it 3 feet wider. Well, 3 feet wider across 6 buildings adds significant construction cost. Then reduce the apartment sizes slightly. People can live with 10% less square footage if the building's actually designed for human beings. Victoria recalculated the numbers discovered. Daniel was right about the math and marked the change. This became their pattern, Victoria proposing standard development solutions, Daniel pushing back with human-centered alternatives, both of them learning to argue constructively rather than defensively. Sophie became an unexpected participant in the design process. She'd wander out of her bedroom during evening work sessions and ask questions about what they were drawing. When Daniel explained they were designing new buildings for Riverside, Sophie requested that they include a space where kids could play even when it rained. An indoor play area adds significant cost, Victoria said automatically, then caught herself. But it's a good idea. Where should it be located? Sophie grabbed a pencil and marked a spot on the blueprint, here on the ground floor so parents can see their kids from outside. The play area went into the final design along with dozens of other modifications that emerged from 3 weeks of intensive collaboration. They added community kitchens where residents could share meals. They designed rooftop gardens that could be maintained collectively. They included ground floor retail spaces reserved for existing Riverside businesses at controlled rents. The work consumed Daniel's evenings and weekends. He'd spend his days on construction sites. Hale Development had reopened Grand Horizon with enhanced safety protocols, and his nights redesigning the neighborhood where he lived. The cognitive dissonance was substantial. By day, he built luxury apartments for wealthy people. By night, he designed affordable housing for his neighbors. The tension showed in his body. He was more tired than usual, more distracted. Sophie noticed and asked if he was sick. Margaret noticed and brought him meals he didn't have time to cook. Victoria noticed but didn't comment, apparently understanding that acknowledging the strain would make it more difficult to continue. 3 weeks into the project, Rick Brennan pulled Daniel aside at Grand Horizon. There's talk. Word is you're working with Victoria Hale on some kind of community development project. Daniel's stomach tightened. Just some consulting work. Consulting work that goes against standard development practices. Some of the higher-ups aren't happy about it. They're saying you're making the company look bad. I'm doing the work on my own time. Doesn't matter. In construction, loyalty is everything. You work for Hale Development during the day and undermine their business model at night, that's a problem. Hale Development's CEO asked me to do this. Victoria Hale asked you. The board didn't approve it. There's a difference. The warning was clear. Daniel was becoming conspicuous, becoming the kind of worker who attracted attention for the wrong reasons. In construction, the safest position was invisible competence. He'd violated that principle by accepting Victoria's project. That evening, he told Victoria about the conversation. She listened without interrupting, then said, "You could stop, I'd understand. Would the project continue without me?" Probably not. The architectural vision is what makes this work. Without that, it's just expensive housing with some affordable units mixed in. Daniel looked at the blueprints spread across his kitchen table. Weeks of work, hundreds of hours, a complete reimagining of how Riverside could develop. Sophie had drawn flowers in the margins of one page. Margaret had left notes suggesting where community bulletin boards might go. "I'm not stopping," he said. "You might lose your job." "I know. Sophie's stability depends on your income." "I know that too." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" "Because some things matter more than job security. You taught me that." "I didn't teach you anything. You already knew it." "Maybe, but you reminded me that knowing something and acting on it are different things." The final design was completed on a Tuesday evening in late October, 6 weeks after Victoria had first appeared at Daniel's apartment. They'd created a comprehensive renovation plan that would transform Riverside over 18 months, protecting existing residents while improving infrastructure and creating spaces that serve community needs rather than developer priorities. Victoria gathered the blueprints and legal documents into her portfolio. "I'm presenting this to the board tomorrow. They're going to fight me. Will you win?" "Probably not, but I'll proceed anyway using personal assets." Daniel walked her to the door. "Thank you for this, for giving Riverside a chance." Victoria smiled, a real smile, not the corporate performance version. "Thank you for showing me what integrity looks like in practice. I've spent 25 years in business without really understanding that concept. You made it real. After she left, Daniel sat at his kitchen table and allowed himself to acknowledge what had happened over the past 6 weeks. He'd risked his job security. He'd spent hundreds of hours on unpaid work. He'd become visible in ways that would probably damage his professional reputation. But he'd also done something meaningful. He'd taken abstract principles about community and fairness and translated them into concrete architectural plans. He'd proven to himself that the education he'd abandoned years ago hadn't been wasted, that the dreams he'd buried could be partially resurrected, that sacrifice could be purposeful rather than merely necessary. Sophie appeared in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Are you done with his buildings, Daddy?" "Yes, sunshine, we're done." "Are they good buildings?" "They're buildings that might help people stay in their homes. That's good enough." Sophie hugged him, her small arms tight around his waist. "I'm proud of you." Daniel held his daughter and understood that this, not the architectural work, not the principle, not even the potential salvation of Riverside, was the equation that mattered most. Sophie's pride meant he'd demonstrated something about how to live. He'd shown her that doing the right thing sometimes required risk, that security wasn't the highest value, that people mattered more than personal comfort. Whatever happened next, whether he kept his job, whether Victoria's project succeeded, whether Riverside survived as a community, he'd already won the only victory that actually counted. His daughter believed the world was a place where people helped each other, where principle meant something, where her father was someone worth being proud of. That belief was fragile. The world would try to break it. But for tonight, in their small apartment in Riverside with blueprints scattered across the kitchen table, it was real and solid and true. And that was enough. Part 3, The Reckoning. Marcus Bennett learned about Victoria's Riverside project on a Wednesday morning while reading the Chicago Tribune's business section over coffee that cost more than Daniel Cole's weekly grocery budget. The article was buried on page 6, a small piece about Hale Development's community-focused initiative that quoted Victoria discussing affordable housing commitments and architectural innovation. Most readers would have skipped past it. Marcus read it 3 times. He sat in his Michigan Avenue office, glass walls, minimalist furniture, the kind of space designed to communicate success rather than facilitate the actual work, and felt something that resembled vindication mixed with rage. Victoria was doing exactly what he'd predicted she would do. She was choosing sentiment over strategy, principle over profit, the fantasy of ethical development over the reality of market forces. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. "I need you to pull all property records for Riverside. Every building Hale Development owns, every lease agreement, every tenant contract. I want to know where they're vulnerable." By Thursday afternoon, Marcus had identified 17 properties in Riverside that Hale Development had purchased but not yet developed. These buildings were caught in legal limbo, too expensive to renovate, under Victoria's new affordable housing commitments, too central to the project to abandon. They represented a financial liability that Victoria's board would eventually notice. Marcus began making phone calls. He contacted rival developers who'd competed with Hale Development for years. He reached out to investors who'd been burned by Victoria's refusal to cut corners. He assembled a coalition of people who shared his fundamental belief that business existed to generate profit, not solve social problems. Within a week, Marcus had structured a hostile acquisition plan. He would buy up enough Hale Development stock to force a board vote on Victoria's leadership. He would present the Riverside project as evidence of her declining judgment. He would argue that a CEO who prioritized community over shareholders had violated her fiduciary duty. It was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria had made herself vulnerable by caring about something other than money. Marcus would exploit that vulnerability by demonstrating that caring was expensive. That principle was a luxury. Shareholders couldn't afford. That sentiment was the enemy of sound business practice. He scheduled the board meeting for late November. Daniel received his termination notice on a Friday afternoon in early November. Rick Brennan delivered it personally, his expression suggesting he'd argued against the decision and lost. "They're calling it restructuring," Rick said, handing Daniel the envelope. "But we both know what this is. You made yourself conspicuous. You challenged the way they do business. They can't have workers who think too much." Daniel opened the envelope and found 2 weeks severance pay, not generous but not insulting either. The termination was effective immediately. He was to clear out his locker and leave the site by end of day. "I'm sorry," Rick said. "You're one of the best workers I've had." But loyalty matters more than competence in this industry. Daniel cleaned out his locker methodically, work gloves, safety glasses, the thermos he'd used for 12 years, photographs of Sophie he'd taped to the inside of the door. Other workers watched but didn't approach. In construction, being fired was contagious. Association with terminated workers could mark you as similarly problematic. He drove home in silence, his mind running calculations. He had 3 weeks of expenses saved. After that, unemployment benefits would cover rent and basic necessities, but nothing extra. Sophie's school supplies, Margaret's payment, the small luxuries that made life tolerable, those would disappear. He'd need to find new work quickly, but his reputation was now complicated. Word traveled fast in construction. He was the worker who challenged standard practices, who'd worked with management against the industry's informal codes. Margaret was in the hallway when he arrived home early, immediately understanding what his presence at 2:30 p.m. meant. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Sophie's at school until 3. Come have coffee." They sat in her kitchen while she poured coffee that was somehow even stronger than Daniel's usual brew. "You knew this would happen," Margaret said. "I knew it was possible. But you did it anyway." "Yes." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her mug. "My husband worked at the steel mill for 32 years. He watched it die slowly, first the layoffs, then the pay cuts, then the closure. He could have left earlier, found work elsewhere, but he stayed because he believed loyalty mattered. The mill owners laid him off 2 weeks before his pension vested. He died 6 months later, heart attack, probably from the stress of trying to find new work at 53. She looked at Daniel directly. "I used to think his loyalty was noble. Now I think it was foolish. Companies don't care about workers. They care about profit. You at least got fired for something that mattered. That doesn't pay rent. No, but it lets you look at yourself in the mirror, and it lets Sophie see her father stand for something." Daniel went home and told Sophie the news, framing it as carefully as he could. "Daddy's job ended today. I'll be looking for new work, so we need to be careful with money for a while." Sophie's face showed fear for the first time since her mother had left. "Are we going to lose our apartment?" "No, we have savings, we'll be okay." "But you're worried, I can tell." Daniel pulled her close. "I'm calculating. That's different from worried. Adults calculate all the time. It's how we make sure everything works out." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Daniel updated his resume and began searching for construction jobs. The market was tight. Most positions required references from recent employers. Hale Development's termination wouldn't technically prevent him from working elsewhere, but the informal networks that governed hiring would make it difficult. He was now the worker who'd been fired for cause, even if the cause was principle rather than incompetence. He sent out 17 applications before midnight. By morning, he'd received 3 automated rejections. Victoria's board meeting occurred on a Tuesday in late November, and she entered the conference room knowing she was walking into an ambush. The agenda had been set by Marcus through his attorney, a review of recent strategic decisions that required shareholder input. In corporate language, this meant a public execution. The board consisted of 9 members, 5 who'd been loyal to Victoria for years, 3 who'd been installed by Marcus during the marriage, and 1 independent director who'd remained neutral through previous conflicts. Victoria needed 5 votes to maintain control. She probably had 4. Marcus attended as a major shareholder, sitting at the far end of the table with the particular confidence of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. He dressed in a gray suit that communicated seriousness and success. His presentation materials were professional, data-driven, devastating. Hale Development has always operated on clear principles. Marcus began once the meeting was called to order. We identify undervalued properties. We renovate efficiently. We maximize return on investment. These principles have generated consistent profit for 15 years. He displayed a slide showing the company's financial performance, revenue, growth, profit margins, shareholder returns. The numbers were impressive. Hale Development had been exceptionally successful by every conventional metric. 6 months ago, our CEO made a decision that represents a fundamental departure from these principles. Another slide appeared showing Victoria's Riverside project, with its affordable housing commitments and community oversight provisions highlighted in red. This project commits company resources to development that will generate below-market returns for decades. It prioritizes social goals over financial performance. It represents a CEO placing personal values above fiduciary duty. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Several had raised concerns about Riverside privately. Now those concerns were being voiced publicly with data to support them. Marcus continued methodically through his presentation. He showed projected losses from affordable housing commitments. He demonstrated how community oversight provisions would slow development and increase costs. He presented testimony from other developers who'd attempted similar projects and failed financially. This isn't about whether affordable housing is good or bad, Marcus said with the false reasonableness of someone making an argument they didn't personally believe. It's about whether a CEO can unilaterally commit shareholder resources to projects that don't generate market rate returns. I'm arguing she cannot. Victoria listened without interrupting, taking notes on the legal pad in front of her. She'd prepared for this meeting but hadn't anticipated how effective Marcus would be at framing her principles as liabilities. He wasn't attacking her competence. He was attacking her judgment, suggesting that caring about community made her unsuitable for leadership. When Marcus finished, Victoria stood. She didn't have slides or data presentations. She had blueprints and a legal document and 12 years of building a company that people actually wanted to work for. Marcus is correct that Riverside represents a departure from standard development practices, Victoria began. It will generate below-market returns initially. It does prioritize community stability over maximum profit. These facts are accurate. She unrolled Daniel's architectural plans across the conference table. But this project also represents something that pure profit-driven development cannot achieve sustainable community growth. These buildings are designed by someone who actually lives in Riverside, who understands what residents need, who's created spaces that serve human beings rather than financial projections. She pointed to specific design elements: the widened hallways for elderly residents, the indoor play areas for children, the community kitchens, the rooftop gardens. Standard development would demolish these blocks and replace them with luxury apartments. We generate immediate profit and destroy a community. Riverside's approach takes longer and costs more, but it creates something that lasts. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd invested in Hale Development during its early years, raised her hand. The financial analysis Marcus presented shows significant losses. How do you justify that to shareholders? By redefining what we measure, Victoria said. If profit is the only metric, then Marcus is right. Riverside fails. But if we measure community stability, resident satisfaction, long-term sustainability, then Riverside succeeds in ways that conventional development cannot. That's not how businesses operate, Marcus interjected. You can't replace profit with sentiment. I'm not replacing profit. I'm expanding what we consider valuable. The debate continued for 2 hours, becoming increasingly technical as board members asked questions about financing structures, risk mitigation, comparable projects. Victoria answered each question directly, acknowledging uncertainties while defending the fundamental approach. Finally, the independent director, a man named Robert Jameson, who'd served on boards for 30 years, spoke. I think we're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether Riverside is profitable by conventional metrics. The question is whether a CEO has the authority to pursue projects that align with company values, even when those projects don't maximize short-term returns. He looked at Victoria. You built this company on integrity. You've always claimed that Hale Development builds things that last, that we're not just developers, but community partners. Riverside tests whether those claims are marketing language or actual principles. If we vote against this project, we're admitting that integrity only matters when it's profitable. The room went silent. Marcus's expression suggested he hadn't anticipated this framing. He'd prepared for a debate about profit versus sentiment. He hadn't prepared for a debate about whether the company's stated values were genuine. The vote was called. 5 board members voted to continue the Riverside project with Victoria's community-focused approach. 3 voted against. 1 abstained. Victoria maintained control, but barely. Marcus stood as the meeting adjourned. This isn't over. You're betting the company on sentiment. When it fails, and it will fail, I'll be here to pick up the pieces. Victoria faced him directly. You're wrong about one thing. This isn't sentiment. This is strategy. Companies that prioritize community build loyalty that can't be purchased. Residents who feel invested in development become advocates rather than obstacles. Riverside will succeed not despite its community focus, but because of it. We'll see, Marcus said and left. Victoria remained in the conference room after the board departed, looking at Daniel's blueprints still spread across the table. She'd won the battle, but not the war. Marcus would continue attacking, continue undermining, continue trying to prove that principle was weakness. The question was whether Riverside could succeed fast enough to validate her approach before Marcus found another angle of attack. She called Daniel that evening. The board approved continuation. Riverside is moving forward. That's good news. Daniel's voice was cautious. You don't sound convinced. I lost my job 3 weeks ago. Savings are running out. I've sent out 47 applications and gotten 3 interviews. None of them led anywhere. My professional reputation is damaged because I helped you. Victoria was quiet. She'd known this would happen, but had hoped Construction's informal networks would be more forgiving. I can offer you a position at Hale Development, direct hire working on Riverside implementation. I don't want charity. It's not charity. It's hiring someone with necessary expertise. You designed this project. You should help build it. Daniel hesitated. What's the salary? Victoria named a figure that was 20% higher than his construction wage, plus benefits and profit sharing if Riverside succeeds financially. Why are you doing this? Because you risked everything for a principal. The least I can do is make sure that risk doesn't destroy you. Daniel accepted the position, though it felt uncomfortably close to the transactional dynamics he'd been trying to avoid. But Sophie needed stability, and refusing help out of pride seemed like luxury he couldn't afford. He started at Hale Development's offices in early December, working with architects and engineers to translate his community-focused designs into buildable structures. The work was different from construction, more abstract, more focused on planning than execution, but he discovered he was good at it. His years of physical building gave him intuitive understanding of what would actually work versus what only looked good on paper. Victoria observed his work without interfering, occasionally asking questions that suggested she was learning something about how buildings serve people rather than profit projections. Their relationship remained professional, but contained undercurrents of something neither of them named, not romance exactly, but recognition. 2 people from completely different worlds who'd somehow arrived at similar conclusions about what mattered. Sophie adjusted to the new routine with the resilience of children who'd learned that change was constant. She liked that her father came home less exhausted, that he sometimes brought blueprints home and let her draw in the margins, that he talked about his work with enthusiasm rather than resigned acceptance. Margaret noticed the change too. You look different, she said one evening when Daniel dropped by to pay her for watching Sophie. Different how? Less tired, more like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I'm designing buildings on a computer instead of building them with my hands. I'm not sure that's what I'm supposed to be doing. You're using your mind instead of just your body. That's different. Not better or worse, just different. The Riverside project began construction in January. The first phase involved renovating existing buildings rather than demolishing them, reinforcing foundations, updating electrical and plumbing systems, improving insulation and accessibility. It was slower and more expensive than new construction, but preserved the neighborhood's character while improving functionality. Marcus watched from a distance, making no overt moves but maintaining pressure through media contacts and investor networks. Articles appeared questioning Victoria's judgment, suggesting that her social experiment would fail financially, implying that Hale Development was becoming too idealistic to compete in real markets. The pressure was constant, but not immediately dangerous. Victoria had secured enough financing to complete at least the first phase of construction. The question was whether Riverside could demonstrate success before Marcus found a way to force another board vote. In March, the first renovated building opened. It housed 60 apartments, half reserved for existing Riverside residents at controlled rents, half available at market rates, that were still below typical luxury development prices. The design incorporated Daniel's community-focused elements, wide hallways, accessible entrances, common spaces that encouraged interaction rather than isolation. The building filled within 2 weeks. Existing residents moved into renovated units that maintained affordability while dramatically improving living conditions. New residents, young professionals, small families, retirees, downsizing moved into market-rate units, attracted by the neighborhood's character and community focus. Local media covered the opening with human interest stories about Margaret, who'd moved from her aging third-floor walk-up into a first-floor accessible unit with an elevator and modern appliances. They interviewed Daniel, who'd designed the building while living in the neighborhood he was helping renovate. They quoted Victoria discussing how development could prioritize people without sacrificing financial viability. The coverage was positive, but Marcus dismissed it as temporary sentiment. Wait until the first financial quarter, he told investors. The numbers will show this approach doesn't work at scale. But the numbers told a different story. The first building operated at 98% occupancy with almost no turnover. Maintenance costs were lower than projected because residents treated the building carefully, taking ownership of spaces they'd helped shape. Community events in the common areas generated social cohesion that traditional luxury buildings couldn't replicate. By June, 3 more buildings had been renovated following Daniel's design principles. All filled quickly. All demonstrated the same patterns: high occupancy, low turnover, unexpected social benefits that conventional development metrics hadn't anticipated. Marcus realized he was losing the argument. Riverside wasn't failing financially. It was succeeding in ways that challenged his fundamental assumptions about development. Community focus wasn't weakness, it was competitive advantage. Affordable housing commitments weren't charity, they were strategic investment in stability. He made one final attempt to undermine Victoria's project. In August, he filed a lawsuit alleging that Hale Development's board had violated fiduciary duty by approving below-market development. He demanded a forensic audit of Riverside's finances in a special meeting to reconsider the project's continuation. The lawsuit was technically legitimate but strategically desperate. Marcus was using legal process as harassment, trying to create enough uncertainty to spook investors and force another board vote. Victoria responded by inviting the media to tour Riverside. She brought reporters through renovated buildings, introduced them to residents who'd remained in the neighborhood because of affordable housing commitments, showed them the community gardens and common spaces that demonstrated how design could foster social connection. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Riverside became a case study in ethical development, the kind of project that urban planners and housing advocates held up as proof that development didn't require displacement. Victoria was profiled in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times business section, architectural journals. Marcus's lawsuit was dismissed in September. The judge ruled that the board had acted within its authority, that below-market returns were acceptable if justified by long-term strategy, that experimentation with alternative development models was consistent with fiduciary duty. It was over. Marcus had lost not just the legal battle, but the larger argument about whether principle could coexist with profit. Riverside had demonstrated that community-focused development could succeed financially while achieving social goals that conventional approaches couldn't match. Victoria called Daniel the evening the lawsuit was dismissed. "We won." "Did we? The lawsuit's dismissed. Riverside is validated. Marcus has no more legal options." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Winning legally isn't the same as winning practically. Riverside still has 15 blocks to renovate. We still need to prove this works at full scale. But we've proven it works at small scale. That's something. It's something, Daniel agreed, but it's not everything. They met in person the following Saturday at Riverside Park, the same place where Victoria had found Daniel months earlier. The neighborhood had changed visibly. Construction equipment surrounded several blocks, new buildings stood beside renovated structures. Residents moved through spaces that felt simultaneously familiar and transformed. Sophie was on the monkey bars demonstrating improved technique to Margaret, who watched from a nearby bench. Victoria and Daniel sat together, watching the community that had somehow survived against considerable odds. "I never thanked you properly," Victoria said. "You risked everything for this. Your job, your reputation, Sophie's stability. You risked more. Your company, your board position, your professional credibility. Maybe we're both equally foolish. Or equally principled." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned something about each other through shared struggle. There was affection between them, but also recognition that their relationship existed in a specific context: the project they'd built together, the community they'd helped preserve, the principle they'd both been willing to risk something for. What happens now? Daniel asked. We finish what we started. 15 more blocks. 3 more years of construction if everything goes perfectly. Probably 5 years realistically. And after that, Riverside exists as proof that development can prioritize people. Other cities will copy the model. Other developers will realize that community focus isn't weakness. Maybe the industry changes slightly because we demonstrated an alternative approach. That's optimistic. I've learned to be optimistic from you. You believed Riverside could survive when I only saw it as real estate. You taught me that buildings serve people, not profit projections. Daniel watched Sophie climb higher on the monkey bars, fearless and certain. She thinks you're part of our family now. She talks about you like you're someone permanent. Am I? I don't know. We've been through something together. We've built something that matters. But I'm not sure what that makes us. Victoria nodded. I'm not sure either. But maybe we don't need to define it. Maybe it's enough that we're both committed to finishing what we started. They sat together until evening, watching Riverside transform around them. The relationship between them remained undefined, not quite romantic, not merely professional, something more like partnership forged through shared purpose. They'd learned that trust wasn't given, but earned through consistent action. They discovered that people from completely different worlds could find common ground in principle. Sophie ran over as the sun was setting, breathless and happy. Victoria, are you staying for dinner? Daddy's making his special pasta. Victoria looked at Daniel, who shrugged. Special pasta is just regular pasta with extra garlic, but you're welcome to join us. They walked together toward Daniel's apartment, three people who'd become connected through accident and choice, through rescue and risk, through the slow work of building something that lasted. The future remained uncertain. Riverside had years of construction ahead. Marcus would continue looking for angles of attack. The industry would resist change, as industries always did. But for tonight, in the fading light of a September evening, they had a community that had survived a project that had succeeded against expectations. A connection between people who'd learned that principle wasn't weakness, but the foundation of everything that mattered. Daniel made pasta with extra garlic, while Sophie set the table, and Victoria helped with a competence that suggested she'd learned domestic tasks recently, probably specifically for occasions like this. They ate together in the small apartment, talking about nothing particularly significant. Sophie's upcoming school project, Victoria's next board meeting, Daniel's plans for the next phase of Riverside construction. It was ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary to people who'd spent months fighting for something larger than themselves. Sometimes the greatest victory wasn't dramatic transformation, but the simple ability to sit together and eat pasta, to plan for tomorrow, to believe that the work they'd done mattered enough to continue. Margaret joined them for dessert, a cake she'd made that was slightly lopsided but tasted perfect. She toasted their success with coffee instead of champagne, because coffee was what they drank, what they could afford, what connected them as people who'd built something real rather than merely valuable. To Riverside, Margaret said. To Riverside, they echoed. And in that moment, in that small apartment, with pasta dishes still on the table and a lopsided cake being divided carefully so everyone got equal portions, they understood that they'd won something that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or property values or board votes. They'd proven that people mattered more than profit, that community was worth preserving, that principle could survive in a world designed to crush it. They demonstrated that one person pulling another from wreckage could lead to something larger, not romance necessarily, but connection. Not transformation exactly, but the slow work of building a world slightly better than the one they'd inherited. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. And sometimes enough was the only victory that actually lasted.